Good evening, I'm Cynthia Hessen. Coming up later in our program, we'll talk about access and early intervention available through Colorado's Crisis Services, the newest part of the state's mental health care system. But we begin with Sue Klebold, who has been on an evolving journey of discovery in the past 17 years, learning to live with the loss of her son, with the knowledge of what he did, and with the grief of all the other families touched by Columbine. You decided to stay out of public sight for quite a long while, and then said that you decided to release the book now because it might be selfish not to let other people know what you've learned. So what have you learned?
Well, I think I have learned primarily that someone whose thinking is distorted, that someone who is certainly having thoughts of suicidality and are becoming a risk to themselves, don't have the same access to the tools of self-governance that the rest of us do. And I believe in the last years of Dylan's life, he was experiencing a brain health crisis that nobody recognized, certainly his teachers, his friends, his parents. We didn't identify what was going on in his mind, and I believe he was in a great deal of pain and wishing to die, and I think this contributed very strongly to his taking part in the Columbine tragedy.
You describe how he was holding a job, was seeing friends. To you, on the surface, this all looked normal?
Yes. He had gotten into trouble in his junior year of high school, where he had been arrested, he and Eric, for stealing something out of a van. He'd gotten in trouble at school for scratching a locker and hacking into the computer system at the school. And this all was a change in his behavior. And at that time, I was terribly upset and concerned, but he got into a diversion program. There was a counselor there, and I asked repeatedly, do you think this means something is wrong? Does he need help? And I talked with him, and his father talked with him, and he just assured us that he was fine and that he didn't need help and that he would be getting his life on track. And in the last 14 months of his life, he did manage his life and didn't have behavioral indicators. He had a job, he went to school, he did the sound for school plays, he went to a prom with friends 3 days before this happened. And there were no behaviors that I could identify to show me that he was a risk to himself or to anyone else.
After it all happened, and later when the police investigators shared with you what they had come up with, what did you find that you hadn't known?
When the tragedy first happened, I was really in a state of denial. I couldn't believe that Dylan was there voluntarily, or that he did those things that people were saying that he did, acted very viciously and sadistically. I believed that he perhaps had been tricked, or something had gone wrong, or there was a prank. And when we went to the sheriff's department for their report 6 months later, I really got to see Dylan for the first time the way others had seen him during this tragedy. He and Eric had made tapes, a number of them, and he was posturing for the camera. They were saying hateful, destructive, racist things. And I really entered a state of shock all over again. I believed I was going to be ill. I remember standing up and almost leaving the room. So that was a time for me that sort of broke down my whole concept of who he was, and I had to sort of redefine who he was in my mind and in my heart.
There was also writing that you didn't know existed. In fact, you were surprised that he even expressed himself in writing.
Right. He had written random pages in notebooks. I mean, some people have believed that there were diaries or journals sitting out, and that was not the case. These were on notebook paper. Sometimes they'd be written on a calendar page. And a full 2 years before his death, he was talking about suffering and being in great pain. He makes a reference to cutting himself at one point. These were things that he had not expressed. I did not observe that he had hurt himself physically.
So you hadn't seen this
I hadn't
cutting.
seen any cutting. So he was, I believe, beginning to be in a mental state where he was seriously considering suicide and wanting to end his life.
You also have said that everything you thought you knew about suicide up to that point was wrong.
Yes.
What have you learned since then?
Oh, I've learned so many things. One of the things that occurred after Dylan's loss was I was in a setting at work, and I had turned to someone next to me and said, I don't think my son loved me, or else he couldn't have done this. And a very lovely, gracious woman that I worked with, who was herself an attempt survivor, turned to me and explained a situation where she herself had been suicidal. And at the time, she explained how even she was preparing to leave behind 3 young children under the age of 7, because she said, in my mind, I perceived that I was a burden, that they would be better off without me. And she began to sort of open the doors for me to understand how someone in a suicidal crisis thinks. And it is not the same way that the rest of us think. They don't have the same judgment, the same things to access that we do.
Do you think Dylan felt that way, that the world would be better off without him?
I believe from Dylan's writings that he was not caught up so much in his being a burden to others, but I believed he was very burdened by the world and by his thoughts that he could not control. He talked about being in pain and suffering, and as the date got closer and closer to the actual event, he writes, I thought I would be dead by now. And he writes, maybe doing an NBK with Eric is the way to break free, and NBK was their shorthand for natural born killers. That's what they were calling this event. So I could see that for Dylan, he just wanted his life to be over. I think that was a very strong motivator, and really the main motivator for his being willing to take part in an event such as this.
Not everyone who considers suicide or even carries it out also carries out homicide.
That's correct. It's a very small percentage, and I have seen estimates of between 1% and 3% of all suicides involve the harming or killing of another person. Most common is partner murder-suicides. The mass shooting type is the rarest of the category. So from what I've been able to figure out, the chances that someone we love, the chances of they're doing something like a school shooting are probably 1 in millions. But the chances that someone you love may be struggling with suicidal thoughts and be hiding behind a facade or a mask to try to look and act normal, that is a much greater likelihood.
The book is A Mother's Reckoning, and there is more of this conversation with Sue Klebold online at video.rmpbs.org. We thank you for the chance to learn about your experience, Sue Klebold. Very good to meet you.
Thank you, Cynthia.